All right, now that we have a repository interface, let's see how we can use it. First, we go to our store application class. So store application. Now here in the main method, first we have to create a repository object. To do that, we call context.getBean and pass user repository.class. Now I need to clarify something here. In the previous lesson, we only defined an interface called user repository. We didn't implement this repository. We didn't create a class called user repository. The actual class or implementation is generated by Spring at runtime. Okay? So we get a repository object and store it in this variable. Now, if we type repository dot, we can see all the methods here. So we have count, we have delete, delete all, find, save, and so on. First, let's save a user in the database. To do that, we create a user object. So var user, we call user.builder. Now let's set the mandatory properties like name, we set it to John, we set email and password, and finally build a user object. And then we call repository.save to save this in the database. Now, this is the beauty of working with repositories. For the most part, we don't have to write any SQL statement. Hibernate will take care of generating the right SQL statements at runtime. And we can actually see those statements. To do that, we have to go to our application YAML file. So let's go to application YAML. Here under the Spring key, we add JPA. And here we set show SQL to true. With this, we can see the actual SQL statements sent to the database on the console window. Now let's run our application. All right, look down here, we have a log statement from Hibernate, and this is the actual SQL statement sent to the database. Insert into users. Here we have the columns, and for values, we have placeholders. These placeholders are filled with actual values at runtime. Now, let's look at our database window and look at the users table. All right, we have this new user. The ID is assigned by the database. Beautiful. So back to our store application class. Now, let's see how we can retrieve this user from the database. So I'm going to delete these few lines. Instead, we call repository.find by ID. We pass 1. Now, because numbers in Java are integers by default, here we have to add L to convert this to a long, okay? Now, find by ID returns an optional object. If the user with this ID exists in the database, we can get the actual user object by calling get. Otherwise, here we can chain or else we can provide an alternative. So if the user with this ID doesn't exist in the database, we can return null. Alternatively, we can throw an exception. So here we call or else throw. Which approach is better? There is no right or wrong here. It really depends on business requirements. So with this, now we get a user object and then print it on the terminal. Now, I believe if we run the application now, we're going to get an exception. Let's have a quick look. All right, I was right. We get a lazy initialization exception. We're going to talk about this later in this segment. So to fix this issue, let's just print the user's email. Let's run it again. All right, here's the user's email. And up here, we have the SQL statement sent to the database. So we're selecting these columns, ID, email, name, and password. We also have profile information like bio, date of birth, loyalty, and so on. So if you pay close attention, we're selecting a bunch of columns from the users table, and we have a left join to the profiles table. Now, the reason this is happening is because of eager loading, which we'll talk about later in this segment, okay? So this is how we can retrieve a user. We can also retrieve all users. So instead of find by ID, we call find all. Now, find all returns an iterable. So here we can call for each and then pass a consumer function. Now, if you're not familiar with the consumer interface, I covered it in depth in the third part of my Java series. So here we pass a lambda function. We get each user and then print. Now, we don't want to print the entire user object because we'll get an exception. So let's print the user's email. Let's run the application. All right, here's our user. Now, finally, let me show you how to delete a user. To do that, we call repository dot. Now, we have a bunch of different methods for deleting objects. We can delete a user object. We can delete all objects. We can delete an object by ID. So for this demo, I'm going to call delete by ID and pass 1L. Let's run the application. All right, we have 4 statements sent to the database, and this is because of the relationship the user object has with other entities. So Hibernate first tries to select some data for the user, then it deletes the associated records from the wishlist table, as well as user tags table. These are child records. Once all the child records are deleted from the database, then it deletes the user from the users table. So now, if we look at the users table, our user is gone. So that was the basics of working with repositories. As we go through this section, you will learn more about the advanced features of these repositories. Next, we're going to talk about entity states.